All right, so let's do a few faces here before we start. And so I would guess just our first one, just what did you think of the game?
When they called those two fouls on Rudy Gobert at the very end to foul him out.
Oh. The Naz Reed tip dunk on the left baseline. And watching Nikola Jokic run around at the end of the game. Okay, let's get started here.
Whew.
Welcome on to a very special Dunc'd On Prime, Dunc'd On Live on YouTube. Please give us a subscribe, and don't forget to set the alerts for when we post a new show or go live as well. We'll, of course, be getting to your comments as well. But this, to me, I just want to put into perspective the way that we're feeling right now about 10 minutes after this game ended. This, to me, was the best series combination of drama and high level of play since 2019.
Off the cuff, absolutely. I think that the level of play, the consequential nature of it, and the way that so many of these games swung, there weren't that many competitive close games in this, but the way that things swung based on the individual brilliance and the overall team strengths was some part of what makes this series so special. I believe I will be thinking about this series for at least 5 to 10 years, probably a lot longer than that. It is one of the most memorable ones I personally believe during the Dunc'd On era. That doesn't mean we'll see where it goes in terms of the long term, the arcs of the franchises involved here, the league in general. But this was an awesome series, and having this as the game 7, the largest game 7 comeback, both halftime and overall, is just an incredible capper on a series that has defied expectations at every single turn.
I thought it was done. At 58-38, they score the first 5 points of the half through Murray. He's having a great game. Wolves just can't score at all. Can't hit a shot. They're turning it over. Ant looks like he's got nothing. They can't get any kind of separation. They can't get two on the ball. They can't get him in rotation. And they just kept on going. And, honestly, Danny, what this game reminded me of was what the Denver Nuggets did to the Clippers in the bubble, where I can't remember if it was 2 or 3, but they had in games 5, 6, and 7 substantial deficits early in the game, and then they just kept coming. There were guys that they had that the Clippers couldn't deal with, and now there are things that the Wolves were doing that the Nuggets couldn't deal with. And it was just an incredible effort to just continue to fight. It's so easy to figure out, well, this is it. We did a great job getting it back here for game 6. We're not supposed to win game 7 on the road. And I think they take their cue from Anthony Edwards, who has no right to be here at this point, leading this type of a team at this point in the playoffs, at this point in his career. And they just never gave up. They kept fighting, and they completely wore down the Denver Nuggets in the end.
The number you're going to hear a lot from me, 58-38. That was the score when Jamal Murray hit that shot. From that point, the Minnesota Timberwolves outscored the Nuggets 60-32 over the course of 22 minutes and 50 seconds. That is an incredible stat. During that time, the Denver Nuggets were 12 of 36 from the field and 3 of 19 on threes. That is a huge part of the story. Minnesota's defense, there are a lot of contributing factors here. We will get into all of those. But I actually want to kind of, before we get into that, which of course is massive and the impacts of the series and everything else, I think it's worth taking a little bit of stock of where this game was before all that happened, because you and I broadcast this whole thing for playback and for YouTube. And I thought that Minnesota's offense was really tepid, really languid in the early part of this game. And that we brought up Anthony Edwards as the tone setter. And during that time, he was not setting an ambitious tone. They were taking too long to get in their stuff. They weren't really active. And so Minnesota wasn't really getting into anything. So I didn't think Denver was playing in the early part of this game. Denver was playing like particularly well, but Minnesota wasn't really getting to anything. They had 19 first quarter points, and it felt like they earned that 19.
And I thought Denver's strategy was pretty good in that they didn't go for just the hard double team immediately on Karl-Anthony Towns as soon as he got a switch. And Towns, he was so important overall because you had to switch everything involving him because of his pick and pop game that they were so worried about. And Edwards, same thing. They really were not sending someone. They were gapping. Certainly, they were looking like they were going to come. But they had just been hard doubling so much in the previous game. And so here, they didn't really bring anyone until maybe like the last 6-7 seconds of the shot clock, as they kind of would just play into the worst tendencies of Karl-Anthony Towns and particularly Edwards of holding the ball, not going fast. Edwards also looked like he just physically was not in great shape after maybe that fall. He just was not looking explosive. He looked kind of stiff. Also, he had to guard Jamal Murray, who went off in the first half, even though that a lot of that wasn't necessarily at Edwards' expense. So I thought the Nuggets strategy was a pretty good one. And I thought Jokic was fantastic in pick and roll defense for, maybe the first 30 minutes or so of the game. Like, he was getting up to touch. He was always there when like a Conley would try to reject a screen and bang a three. And the Nuggets' overall activity was really good. I thought they had a great plan. To me, I thought they actually did defend pretty well, with the caveat that Edwards was not looking like his explosive self for the first half at minimum.
Yeah, and one of the key stretches during the early portion of the game was Rudy Gobert comes out to end the first, and between the end of the first and early second, so Gobert was back for the second portion of this. So at the end of the first, it was Denver outscoring Minnesota by 7, but part of that was a Minnesota scoreless streak, which ended up being 5 minutes and 5 seconds, and so they were going poorly then, and it was that stretch along with a little bit before that illuminated something that I was expecting to see in Game 7, which was Minnesota surprised Denver with a lot of doubling of Nikola Jokic in Game 6, and my expectation was that if they went back to it, Denver would have more strategies. And there were a couple of really nice plays where like they set an off-ball flare screen at around the right time. And so Denver was getting looks. And that was a part, not the whole thing, for why Jamal Murray was so hot in the first half. Jamal Murray's first half stats: 24 points on 8 of 15 from the field, 3 of 5 from 3, and then another 5 of 10. Sorry. Yeah, 5 of 10 inside the arc. Got to the line for 5 free throws as well. And he did have 2 turnovers, but the Nuggets only had 5 in the entire first half. This was a low turnover game overall. We'll get into some of that. And so Jokic, it wasn't the greatest scoring performance from him, and we kind of tracked that a little bit at the time. He was 6 of 12 from the field, but Murray was fantastic. That well just ran dry more in the second half.
Yeah, he was. He came out ultra aggressive. Michael Malone had said he wanted him to not eat and be hungry come 6 o'clock Mountain Time on Sunday. And he did come out with that level of aggression. They got him better matchups at times than Edwards, who I thought he never really had much success against in the series, but he hit a tough step back 3 early, hit a couple more threes. I think it was right at the end of the first. And then also I thought he was excellent attacking the basket, and they were setting good screens on him. They knew that Karl Towns was going to stick to Nikola Jokic. That's what they'd been doing, that they're going to send him downhill into Gobert. And so Murray was not as sped up in those circumstances. He slowed down. He got 3 buckets at the rim as Denver was building their lead. And then he also had a couple of nice passes, including a beautiful jumping lefty bounce pass to Gordon for a dunk and a 2-on-1 with Gobert. So everything was looking pretty good for the Nuggets with 58 points just in a slow paced game, just into the start of the second half. And then anything that stuck out to you from that first section before we get to the Minnesota comeback?
Absolutely. Christian Brown versus Michael Porter Jr. So this was a tough Michael Porter Jr. game. He also had a terrible foul towards the end of the game when Denver was trying their last-ditch comeback. But MPJ, it isn't just that he missed his shots and Porter Jr. being 3 of 12 from the field, getting some clean looks and then not going down. That's a part of it. But he was also pretty aggressively attacked on defense, had some basic mistakes, wasn't spacing everything out. And so Christian Brown comes in and he, he didn't do everything perfectly, but he was able to execute the basic points. And one of my favorite possessions that Brown had, he did a beautiful job in the first half. It was defending an Anthony Edwards isolation. And then the ball tips out. Brown gets the rebound, kind of spins around and gets a run out for a dunk. And his energy level and his execution was very important for the Nuggets when they were looking for a fifth guy at times in this one.
Yeah, they were. As Porter Jr. did not have it shooting the ball 1 of 6 from 3. And a big problem for their scheme, too, is that he couldn't guard Karl Anthony Towns or Anthony Edwards. And so part of the reason why they had to do so much double teaming, which they ramped up as the game went along, was because of that. But then they also couldn't hit a 3, as we'll get to. Nuggets offensive rebounding was fantastic in the first as well, 14-2 second chance points. And most of their offensive rebounds came right at the rim, maybe off a missed layup, so they're able to tip it back. So that can be a bugaboo for the Wolves as well.
Well, and
really looked like it was all collapsing for them.
Yeah, Minnesota only took 7 shots in the restricted area in the entire first half. They took 8 from floater range, were only 1 of 8 on those upper paint shots. And that was a potential challenge for them. Also 1 of 10 above the break. Not fantastic. And then some of those, you would expect to go in, but some of them were kind of tired, short Anthony Edwards 3-pointers. And another factor in the game at different moments, thankfully it wasn't definitive for the outcome here. There were some soft fouls at times. It was weird because the first quarter, there were basically no fouls called the entire time. But then the second quarter got Jaden McDaniels a little bit on tilt. He got a soft third foul for holding Murray, which you and I both thought was a garbage call. And then he just kind of was a little bit off during that stretch. And then to compound that, right at the very end of the half, Denver gives up a transition opportunity, but Christian Brown stops Mike Conley, and then Jamal Murray gets the finish. And remember, there have been some big second half, end of second quarter specifically, swings in the series. The other one, of course, being the Jamal Murray half-court shot that was the 8-0 run that happened in I think, was that game 3? And so
game 4.
It might have been game 4. And so Denver, it was, at that point, it was still a pretty comfortable margin for them, but to go from 38-48 to 38-53 in just a matter of kind of a few seconds, that was really important too.
Yeah, and Conley, I thought, was really struggling in the first half. And at one point, he and Ant were a combined 2 out of 15. Both of them, I think, only had 1 field goal in the first half apiece. And Conley, I thought he came out very aggressively with the Achilles in game 6, and it worked out pretty well for them. I thought he was a little bit too ultra aggressive in this game. Had got some drives, which he generally doesn't do much of anymore. And like that play on Brown, where it was a 2-on-1, he could have thrown it back to Ant for the dunk and just tried to go in. He was missing some passes. Like, clearly he knows where he's at in his career, and desperately wanted to win this one. But he played a much better second half as well. Hit a ridiculous late clock 3 in the second half. Well, and I thought he was really good defensively too. Ended up a game best plus 12.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. And something else that I mentioned at the time was that even though Minnesota, they were close in the Kyle Anderson minutes, I thought that was a little bit fortunate. That was a weird stretch during the second quarter when Gobert got fouled twice in a row by Justin Holiday on seals, something that Gobert has actually done really well in this series. And that is particularly when Anderson and Gobert were on the floor together, that was something he could exploit. Chris Finch apparently agreed because Kyle Anderson did not play a second in the second half.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who didn't play a second in the second half on these benches. I thought the other thing, you mentioned the refereeing a little bit. I thought that the Wolves did overcome the refereeing in this game. And not to say, of course, that there's any bias, but I thought there are a lot of soft calls which largely favored the Nuggets, including the 2 that fouled Gobert out of the game, although they already were up 10 at that point. And a couple of those cheap ones off the ball on McDaniels, the one where Ant got transition and KCP just raked him across the arms with no call, and then Gobert immediately got another foul. He actually came into the fourth quarter with only 3 fouls and didn't play a lot of the fourth quarter. So
yeah, and then that was a bad moving screen call. I do think it was an illegal screen, but kind of compounded with the egregious one that wasn't called immediately before it. It was a tough swing for Minnesota.
Yeah, and then he gets his last two on I think he got 2 on one possession then right after that.
Yeah, it was the same trip down the I think you're right.
So Murray scores the first 5 points of the second half, including on a 3. And he's up to 29 points. It's 58-38. You're just like, man, Denver's defense has been amazing. Minnesota just can't score right now. And you're like, well, this is that old Minnesota offense. Again, that was their biggest Achilles heel in games 2 through 5, all of which they lost. Or sorry, 3 through 5, all of which they lost, of course. And they were just holding on the ball too long. At least they didn't turn it over too much. That was an important thing. To only have 7 turnovers in a game like this was very important. But they just started getting Denver to miss. And the big thing that really changed from the first half was Denver not able to get to the rim at all in that disastrous third quarter, which saw them score 5 points right at the beginning and then 4 points basically from maybe 2 minutes in until the last minute 30 of the quarter when they scored 5 quick more points. And they equaled. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, and I want to say where those points happened because I think this is really memorable. So the first point that they scored in this lull was Jokic splitting 2 free throws on a very soft Karl-Anthony Towns foul that was unsuccessfully challenged by the Wolves. And so Jokic, Towns got him, but like it was simultaneously a sufficient enough call to be a foul and sufficient enough to be held on review. So then Minnesota didn't have a challenge for the rest of the game. Jokic splits those free throws. Their next made basket was extremely lucky. KCP missed a step back 2, tips out to Aaron Gordon, who frantically throws it to Brown to try to save it with the shot clock. Brown just kind of like chucks it and gets that to save that possession. And then that's their only basket. So Jamal Murray makes his shot with 10:50. Jokic gets the free throw at 8:49. Christian Brown gets that fortunate shot at 4:40. And then Denver's next basket is Jokic getting a mid-ranger with 1:16 left in the third quarter.
Yeah, and so they only score 14 points in the quarter, and they had to race at the end to do that. And we noted it in the last game that Denver, in the first quarter of Game 6, had their lowest scoring quarter of the season. Then they outdid themselves there with a 9-point quarter in the fourth quarter once the game was mostly put away in Game 6. And then they also had another 14-point quarter, which they barely made it to in this third. And that, of course, the third quarter is what killed them, because then Jokic stays on the floor the whole time. He ends up playing 46 minutes and was not particularly efficient. And they would have loved to get him some rest. They did get a little bit for Murray, but then they got smoked in those minutes when Murray was out. If memory serves, their Wolves were really ramping up the pressure there, so they had to come back with him earlier than they wanted to. The lack of shooting was really rough. Even KCP only hit 1. He and Porter Jr. combining for 2 for 10. And it really was, in the end, that strategy of just making Denver shoot the ball from the outside. Like, Murray and Jokic having to combine for 21 3-point attempts is just, that's way more than those guys want to take, and they force them to take it because mostly of the presence of Gobert.
And one of the other dynamics of the third quarter was that because of where Murray and Jokic shoot from, those are generally above the break threes. Minnesota in that third quarter alone generated 6 corner threes. That is more than they necessarily do. They had 14 overall in the game.
And I thought they actually could have come back even faster had they hit some of their own open shots. But it was really more of a walk on the offensive end. But the defense was just so dominating. / the Nuggets just couldn't hit an open one.
Yeah, Towns and Edwards both had a couple that they could. Cat had this. He was 5 of 6 in the early going, and then missed 3 shots rapid fire in the beginning of the third quarter as Denver kind of went on that little 5-0 run that pushed the lead to 20. And then Yeah, I agree with you. Like Jaden McDaniels hit a couple of big ones, and Minnesota, if they had gotten something, and then Conley stayed really aggressive overall in this game. He only took one shot though in the third quarter, but that was a big three as well.
Yeah, that was the one at the end of the shot clock, right? Where he just had to like step side. I mean, he's hit a couple of threes kind of going to his left, which I don't recall him ever shooting before these last two games. Yeah, and Denver just really did not have much diversity to their offense. I think the other thing that made this matchup so difficult for Minnesota is just the way that Gobert could really erase Aaron Gordon. And I thought Gobert actually defended Jokic pretty well when that was the matchup. Like his level of effort, I thought when everyone's exhausted in the fourth quarter, Rudy Gobert, he did only end up playing 36 minutes. He would have got to close to 40 had he not fouled out. But his effort level, particularly as Denver is trying to frantically make their comeback in the fourth, was just amazing. The way he was getting out on Murray, retreating back to Jokic, multiple efforts. He was just fantastic.
The Denver Nuggets only took 6 shots in the restricted area during the second half of this game, and I know at least one of them was in the version of garbage time that this game had. And Rudy Gobert, he should not be an unsung hero. He should be a fully sung hero of this series. And the way that he helped make Denver's offense harder, that they couldn't get some of their easy stuff, they couldn't get some of their system stuff around the basket. And one measure of this is that Aaron Gordon scored 4 points in this game. They couldn't generate any of those things. And so, yes, Denver missing a bunch of threes in a game 7 is a part of why their offense went so poorly. But a part of it is that they couldn't get the easy stuff because Jokic had another challenging game, and then some of those are going. He's the unbelievable touch and everything else. But when Denver can't get KCP, they can't get Michael Porter Jr. or Christian Brown, kind of little stuff around the basket. I'm not going to say cheapies because they earn them, but it makes everything harder. And Denver generally doesn't have to. They work smart for their baskets. They don't always have to work hard.
Yeah, Denver had a stretch in the first as they surged back into the lead in the first quarter without Gobert, where it looked great for them offensively. They got to the basket a ton, but then they weren't able to repeat that when Gobert went out. Minnesota's kind of making their comeback, and you're like, oh, well, here's the non-Gobert minutes. They got smoked in these in the first. They'd gotten smoked in them basically ever since the first two games, but ever since game 2, when, of course, they played without Gobert entirely. So that was a really difficult thing for Denver to not beat up Reed and Towns in those minutes, and having to come back with Murray earlier than they wanted to, not being able to get Jokic a rest in those minutes as well. Let me ask you a question here. As you kind of do a little bit of a post-mortem for Denver on why they lost. Well, let's just talk a little bit more about the fourth quarter, and then we can maybe shift over to that.
Sure.
Edwards went basically the whole second half, but they did manage to get him about a minute, and I thought they did a great job at getting him back in the game with about 30 seconds left in the third quarter, and that's when he actually got that pick 6 for a steal, if memory serves. And I thought his defense on Murray, I know Murray had a big first half, but in the second half in particular, his defense was amazing. And part of why the Jokic and Murray pick and roll just wasn't as deadly through most of this series was when Ant was on Murray, and he took that assignment the entire game, basically. They put McDaniels on Porter Jr. as part of, I think, why Porter Jr. struggled. But Ant is so fast that he's able to actually like go under multiple times on Murray and just meet him on the other side. And Murray is not someone, particularly if he's a little further out on the floor, he's not someone who's going to just like pull the three at the slightest glimmer of daylight. Ant is already meeting him on the other side, so then he has to rescreen. Ant meets him again, and it just would bleed so much of the shot clock out.
And it's the combination of speed and strength, because then he meets him on the other side, and Murray can't go to that power game that he likes so much. And so it's basically a perfect antidote for what Jamal Murray does well. And not only, Nate, did Anthony Edwards get that pick 6, he also got that crazy step back 3 at the very end of the third quarter, where he got extra space on it and made that. And that was what cut it from a 4-point deficit to a 1-point deficit. And we're like, ooh, we're cooking with gas here. And that might have been even more motivation for Malone to keep Jokic on the floor.
Yeah, it was a great sub by Chrissa Finchy, and to get him back in the game and get 5 quick points and also like make a 2-for-1 out of that steal. That was really just massive. You felt, maybe Denver was getting back into control slightly, and then in the end they weren't, and he was able to go the rest of the way. Karl-Anthony Towns gets his 5th foul, and they decide to go with Naz Reed. And Naz Reed had played pretty poorly up to that point, and just getting those fresh legs in at that point in the game clearly mattered a ton, because he was able to get a drive, step around Jokic, who was not a great rim protector in the best of times, but was too exhausted to move with him. He got another 2 blocks on Jokic. Like he's blocked Nikola Jokic's shot more than I can ever remember any player doing in a playoff series. I think he's gotten him multiple times in 3 separate games on plays where it's just like right in front of him. Jokic is usually so good at using his body to ward guys off and knows exactly where the defense is. He couldn't deal with Reed. Reed had this incredible tip dunk. Both he and Karl-Anthony Towns just flew in from the 3-point line. The Nuggets are too exhausted to box those guys out, and they just flew in off of 1 foot for massive tip dunk. So Reed's energy level at a time when everyone else was kind of flagging, to have a guy that you could bring in who's playable, who also is able to guard Jokic a little bit, keep Gobert out of that matchup at least some, was so massive in the 4th quarter.
And it came on the heels of Reed having he had a pretty bad goaltend, which was correctly called, but it had no real chance of going in. It was like, you're like, Reed a little bit hyper aggressive, but he then responded and he did really well. And we saw that going back to game 1, where Naz Reed was bad in the first half and then came back and had a huge stint in the second half as they helped key Minnesota's win there. And he stepped up. And again, we're talking about the story of this game. The single most improbable, ridiculous, amazing play of this game was Rudy Gobert Sombor shuffle. Like, it was with like 2 seconds left on the shot clock. They just threw the ball at him and just like, there's no way. And he makes that.
They almost got the ball completely denied in bounds on a baseline out of bounds. And then they get it to him. And the Sombor shuffle, that if you guys don't know it, that is the shot that Nikola Jokic created, where you step back with your right foot and shoot off your right foot, going to your right on a fadeaway, and Gobert just drained it on him. He also had that great finish for the and one as well. He made his free throws, 7 and 9 from the foul line, another common Gobert bugaboo, and hit a bunch of them in the 4th. But they hit a couple of pretty crazy shots in this one for sure.
Yes, they did. But that's a part of this. And Denver missed some shots that normally go in, but you create the opportunity for that variance to matter by doing everything else as well as Minnesota did.
And this actually, it was very similar 4th quarter to what took place in game 1, which you referenced, of where you're like, oh, well, Denver, they're going to close it out. This is the only other close game we've had in this series, and Denver is so amazing at closing these games, and they got the altitude advantage, they got the stamina advantage, and against everyone else that they've played really at full strength, that's kind of been the case. And in both of these, like, Minnesota just went up by 10 with like 3 minutes left, and you're like, wait a minute, I guess they're just gonna do it. And Denver, like the Denver run, you thought it was coming, it just never actually came. In the end, they never got closer than 6, and that was in the last minute after everyone had kind of given up at that point. So like Minnesota just like, they just out physical Denver, which is a team that is out physical everyone else with their size and all of that along the front line. And Jokic looked worn down, Danny, for basically the first time I've ever seen him in the 4th quarter. That just shows you the level of pressure and athleticism the Wolves were able to bring.
And consistently over the course of a game, being able to cycle players in, change who was guarding Jokic, change the coverage on him. And it's also the shot was available, but you brought this up earlier. Jokic taking 10 threes in a game. That's generally a sign that a team is defending him reasonably well. And sure, Jokic isn't going to go 11 of 18 on twos most of the time. He has better touch than that, but they were defending him
11 of 18 on twos is pretty good, I suppose.
It's pretty good, but Jokic is appalling. Like, he can do a lot of those things differently.
He can do better than that, but I don't know if it's, what did he shoot, like 65% or something this year? That's about right. But
I think that's about
right.
But yeah,
it was, but he wasn't, like, we just didn't feel him in that same way. It seemed like whenever he got the ball, it was like, oh, thank God they're not doubling. Like there was one play where he missed it when he realized they weren't doubling, and then he scored the next time. But it was just, it seemed like the windows were so small for him. And when you saw him just be affected in a way that we haven't seen, I would say maybe the last time was against the Warriors in the first couple games in 2022, but he figured it out. And that was the other thing that was so crazy. I mean, I guess we'll talk about the overall flow of this series. I got a lot of larger points to make, but what else stuck out to you from this one?
I brought up how in the first half, Minnesota only took 7 shots in the restricted area. That goes up to 13 in the second half, including those 2 tip dunks, and they were 10 to 13 there. And Jokic's pick and roll defense in general and his rim protection as well, those were more limited as he got tired in the second half. And to me, a great representation of that, going back to old Jokic, the criticisms that we had was a play where he's back and Naz Reed is driving down. And Jokic, instead of actually trying to contest because he's a 7-foot human being and can do that, he just stands still, tries to draw the charge, and Reed just goes around him with a Euro step. And so it's like, you're a big dude. You have to actually try on that possession.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't even like move enough to play the fat guy defense and kind of bump him while looking like he was being stationary or go for the strip or anything. I mean, his fatigue, and he played the entire second half. He played 46 minutes. I think that's and I think in retrospect, you would say they probably should have tried to get him a rest, but they don't have a backup center. And then they also felt like Peyton Watson wasn't playable in this series. And then Porter Jr. is not playing well. And Aaron Gordon has already gotten 42 minutes of his own. And so it just was the lack of a sub that you felt could hold down the fort for a little bit. I mean, they've generally have played very well when he's been off the floor these last 2 years, but they just didn't. Minnesota getting back into contact as much as they did that quickly in the third before he could rest was massive.
Well, and Nate, another part of that story is that Minnesota, and this isn't just because they won the series, Minnesota is the most talented team with the available players that Denver played either last year in their title run or this year. And I think
it's not even close.
That made some of these things harder. And the non-Jokic minutes, of course, historically have gone terribly in the regular season. There are fewer of them, but that created a little bit of pressure for Denver being uncomfortable. This isn't going to be the full postmortem on their season, their legacy, anything like that. But not having enough players that they could trust and not having a way to go in those minutes is an important part of this game and overall the series.
Let's see if there's Karl Anthony Towns, we probably didn't talk about him enough. He was on the edge, certainly, in terms of the fouls, and he got his money's worth or lack thereof with his couple of cheap chuck fouls. But he led the Wolves with 23 points, 8 of 14 from the field. And he only missed 1 2-pointer in the game. He had that game-sealing tip dunk.
Well, and Edwards, Towns. One of the things that Towns did best in this game, he was a really effective late clock shot attacker. So if the Wolves got the ball with 6 seconds to go and it was in Towns' hand, it went better than when it was Edwards because he would generally have some sort of mismatch. And there were a couple where it's like, oh, I don't know if he has enough time to get it off, even though he has an advantage. And he'd like rip through or do something else and he'd get to a quality look, whether it went in or not, but it usually did. And that saved a few of those Minnesota possessions, both in the early part of the game when he was 5 of 6 from the field, but there were a couple late. And of course, he had that huge tip down.
And we shout out Derek Lively last night. Same to Towns, to be able to come back from a surgery in such a small amount of time, come back better in terms of his body composition. His stamina was excellent in this game. I thought some of the stuff he was doing, like he's like top-siding Jokic, trying to come off a screen. That's part of what makes Jokic so difficult to deal with, right? It's like he's a center. He's using these screens. Centers aren't used to guarding that. Like he actually really warmed to that task, and he had enough bulk to slow Jokic down some too.
And Nate, I don't think Jokic got a face cut for an easy layup on him in this entire game.
Yeah, he tried a couple, but Towns kind of stayed with him a little bit too. I mean, I don't think the Nuggets really, maybe during that stretch when Gobert went out the first time in the first quarter, but generally they didn't give up hardly anything easy in terms of just those little like system buckets. And yeah, he was Towns. They didn't want to put Porter Jr. on him because they're going to run pick and roll at Towns, and then Porter Jr. would have to switch onto a ball handler that he couldn't guard. So they had to put, like KCP, Christian Brown on him sometimes, or they would go Gordon, of course, too. But then Towns was able to post up and they got just enough out of it. I thought he saved them, particularly in the first half when particularly Ant didn't have anything going on at all. Jaden McDaniels had 21 points in this game, and he had an incredible block of an Aaron Gordon dunk in the first half and went 3 of 4 from downtown. He had a couple of huge ones, and that hit a pretty difficult jumper or two as well. And another guy, when you put someone like him on Michael Porter Jr., was not going to be able to do anything. He was fantastic as well, and was able to overcome that first half foul trouble to play 39 minutes in his own right. So that was really fantastic. The bounce dunk at the end was maybe a little unsportsmanlike. I'm like, all right, the people who are going to get pissed off about this, like showboating at the end. Well, number one, the Nuggets still work, like kind of trying to pressure up. The shot clock wasn't off, and they hadn't conceded, but also maybe just dunk that in KCP did foul him on it. But that was at the end of a series like that. I don't think there's a need to showboat and show up your opponent necessarily in that sort of a circumstance when it's on like the first possession when they're kind of giving up. But that's the sort of like mentality that the Wolves had that probably served them well, that they just were going to take no quarter and they didn't care who was across from them and they're going to do what they're going to do.
I want to, or do we want to kind of move on to a couple things about the series, or do you want to stay on this game?
Yeah, I think so. That's about all that I have.
So I pulled up, because NBA.com has them, Basketball Reference is not yet, because we're recording this right after the series, the series long stats. And I think some of this is pretty telling from this one. I'm having to filter through it because I didn't sort out by the specific teams. Jokic overall in the series, 59.6% true shooting on 32 usage. That is the second highest usage rate of any player who played significant minutes in the second round. Jalen Brunson, the only guy who was higher, at 34.8.
Yeah. And that's the lowest true shooting I can remember from Jokic in a series in a very long time.
Yes. And so, I mean, but overall, that's still very good. Anthony Edwards, lower at 28.6, still one of the highest around. Shea and Tatum are between Jokic and Edwards, but 60.9. So he was a more efficient individual scorer in this series than Jokic, and the Wolves had a better offensive rating when Edwards was on the floor than the Nuggets did when Jokic was on the floor. There is one other player in this series that was in this high range, and that was Jamal Murray. 27.3 usage, 48% true shooting. And that is including today's game where he had 35 points, though was on 13 to 26 from the field.
This is the first team that we've really seen slow down these Nuggets. And just the way that this series played out was incredible, Dan, that you felt like the Wolves were going to beat them. And then the Nuggets are like, oh, no, fuck this. We're going to come out. We're going to be incredibly physical. We're going to show these guys who we are. And they take a 3-2 lead, in part due, of course, to the fact that Conley didn't play Game 5. And probably in the prognostication of this Game 7, maybe that was too easily forgotten, that Conley did not play Game 5 due to the
Wolves' offense was terrible in Game 5.
Truly terrible. So, but you felt like that, and Jokic had this unbelievable game. Like and Murray had a good enough Game 3. You felt like Jokic was just gonna be able to take him home. And then the Wolves were like, no, like they changed up their strategy even more. They were gonna double Jokic more. They're gonna make Murray beat them, which he wasn't really able to do. He did it for a half in this game, but he couldn't do it in the second half. And then to just say, yeah, like they are the first time. I've been saying this since the Nuggets really started this run of like, hey, you got to make these guys shoot more threes. And now the Nuggets made all of them in Game 3. And I think that kind of got Minnesota out of what the strategy should have been. And in that Game 5, they score their 25 of 37 at the rim.
Yeah.
And then Minnesota just completely shut off the water at the rim on them in the last two games. And that was really double teaming on Jokic, not letting him just dictate the action by getting into the lane with the ball and keeping Gobert around the rim and just saying, we're going to trust ourselves to fly around enough. And we just don't think that the Nuggets can hit enough threes in spot up situations. And they took the Nuggets out of what they wanted to do. And I thought, as we noted, it was telling that Jokic takes the 10 threes, but he's made threes when he's needed to in prior years when that's been available. I mean, some of the shots that you remember he hit against the Lakers last year, and for whatever reason, like Jokic, whether it was fatigue, just bad luck, whether he just didn't shoot the three that well, whatever. Like that was a shot that they really needed him to make in this series, in these last two games, and he just was not able to crack it open enough by hitting that three and really like adding one more element that they had to deal with.
Going back to a point you just made, I was pulled this stat. The Minnesota Timberwolves rotation player who had the best net rating in this series was Mike Conley, plus 13.6 when he was on the floor. In part because he didn't play in Game 5, which was one of Minnesota's worst performances. But they really needed him. Had the offense was at a 117 when he was on the floor. And the other part of Conley, and this kind of ties in weirdly with Jokic, is the lack of suitability of replacement. So Nickeil Alexander-Walker is a very good basketball player, but he doesn't do what Conley does. And having that organization out there, that made a really big difference for them and put Edwards in a better chance to succeed and everything else. And yes, if you were wondering, Minnesota's defense was meaningfully better when Gobert was on the floor than when it was off. Even they had a 106.6 defensive rating with Gobert on the floor. That's better than the other principal Wolves other than Conley, even though Gobert missed their best defensive game.
As you look back on this series, was Minnesota like clearly the better team to you?
It's very hard to contextualize Game 2. Like Game 2 was such an overwhelming performance, the best defensive half I've seen a team play, maybe during the entire Dunc'd On era. And that was with Gobert off the floor. They were so surprising. And so in some ways, it depends how much you count that, because if you count Game 2 as being a part of the sample, then to me, yes, they absolutely were. And because that was a dominant performance by them. And Denver was comfortable in a lot of their wins, but I don't think any of them were quite at that same level. And then remember, Minnesota ran them off the floor in Game 6. Like Game 6 was a demolition as well. And so from their perspective, like, and that I think that you get there. And so for me, I discount Game 2 a little bit due to the novelty, but only a little bit. So yes, I think Minnesota was the best team.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, I mean, yeah, they just, in terms of point differential, they beat him down pretty badly, I think, even though Denver got blowouts in games 3 through 5. Actually, I would like to know what the point differential was for the series. But yeah, games 2 and 6 were just complete boat racings and continued on into garbage time as well, particularly in Game 6. Yeah, I would have to say, I mean, certainly Minnesota's the more complete team. And their defense was just that good. And, now when you say better, we're going to say just as the teams were in that state. Well, yeah, Jamal Murray dealing with the calf, sure. He had moments where he was able to be good. Maybe it was just the mental fatigue of battling through that. He also had this elbow issue that apparently was no problem in this game. And Minnesota missed Gobert for a game. They missed Conley for a game and had him limited in the last two, although you couldn't tell because he really just fought through that incredibly well. So, yeah, I think it's hard to say, and particularly because the Nuggets were just so exhausted by the end. And like, this is something that like they took the Nuggets out of their game, I would say. And I don't think that the Nuggets were able to do that back to them. Maybe in Game 5, you could say they were with the Jokic going right at Gobert. But finding the strategy of having Gobert off the ball was Denver never truly solved that, I would say. And, Murray, just with the great guys that they had defending him, certainly you would say that Minnesota is matched up very, very well with them. And yeah, could Jokic and these support guys and Murray have hit some more shots? Like, I mean, they were just so atrocious from 3 in the last 2 games. Yes, but they also, that's not what they are built to do. They're built to dominate at the rim. And the Wolves took them out of that in a way that we just haven't seen before. And so you can't say that when Denver couldn't do the primary thing against them that they are built to do, that Denver is a better team than them in this particular matchup.
And before Game 7, Minnesota, I looked at the overall points, plus they were outscoring the Nuggets by 4.7 per game going into Game 7. So that and Game 7 would have expanded it a little bit because they won by 8. So yeah, their blowouts were bigger. Now, a lot of that overall differential is fueled by that 115-70, but that game counts too.
So I want to go back to one other time here, and it involved a Frenchman with one of the biggest wingspans in NBA history, and that is the second to last game of the regular season. Denver is up 17 in the fourth quarter, and they blow the lead against Victor Wembanyama and the Spurs in San Antonio. Like, not an inexcusable loss. Like, they're actually playing okay, although a lot of their guys were injured and done for the season other than Wembanyama. But even think of the fact that, the Spurs probably would have liked to have shut Wembanyama down, and he was like, no, I'm playing in this game. He really wanted to play in that game, and they end up beating them, and Denver would have been the number one seed. They would not have had to play Minnesota until the conference finals. Minnesota maybe could have lost in the second round, or things would have been different, or this would have just happened in the conference finals rather than in this round, and maybe Denver would have been more ready to go. Although I don't know that Denver against Dallas would have been like that much better for the Nuggets. I would have liked to have seen that series. Like, it seems like Luka versus Jokic is the Giannis versus Embiid that we're just never going to get in the playoffs in the Western Conference. But that's like, that really mattered, that they had to play these guys, that they were not the number one seed after they were in pole position. They beat the Wolves to get into that pole position. They were unable to close out San Antonio in San Antonio. And I think you can say, and I think this is something that Michael Malone, who, he likes to get into all these like toughness and motivation things, but I think he was correct in some of his assessments of this team of like, are we going to play? Like, they didn't really come to play with enough force in the first two games. Then they figured it out, and they probably were like, hey, we got this team figured out. We won 3 in a row. It hasn't been competitive. And then Minnesota came out and punched them in the mouth again with a new strategy and a better strategy and better execution in game 6. Then they came out again. They went up 20, and I think they just, like, they clearly ran out of gas in the end. But surely you would have to say, looking at this Nuggets season, this goes back even to that Spurs game, that they just maybe got a little bit, and this happens to every champion, right? We saw it with those Warriors teams. Got a little big for their britches of just like, okay, I guess we'll play now. See, we can do it. Now we can relax again. And that may have bit them in the end.
The margin for error was tough. And a couple other things before we move all the way on. One is a wonderful series for Chris Finch. And I mean, how you define coaching staff credit, I think there's going to be too much to Mike and Nori here. Chris Finch is on the bench. It's his team. We used to say that even when like Steve Kerr wasn't with the Warriors because he had that back surgery. It's still Chris Finch's team. He's right there. And the way that Minnesota, they do have really good personnel for slowing down Denver, and Anthony Edwards burning the candle at both ends, which Jamal Murray was a huge part of this. But it wasn't only the initial evaluation and Minnesota going up huge in the series. It was when they had to adjust their personnel, that worked out. When they wanted to go to a different strategy, generally that worked out. And there were times that Denver got a response, but you still get the gains that you had before Denver responds. And so game 6 is a part of that story. Game 1, game 2, and you need all of those wins to win a series 4-3.
Well, and to come out with that pressure and to just embarrass them. And then the Nuggets responded with some of their adjustments, like Aaron Gordon bringing the ball up, and then to feel like, oh, well, we don't have the pressure anymore. We just got blown out 3 games in a row. Mike Conley is injured. It would just have been so easy for them to lay down. But again, it goes back to that precociousness. I think they take their cue from Edwards and also from Chris Finch, who has like to get Anthony Edwards to defend the way he did, and Naz Reed and Karl Anthony Towns to actually like give Jokic problems, albeit with Gobert behind him, and to turn Jaden McDaniels into a fantastic defensive player when he certainly did not have that reputation at the lower levels. I think it's a great point that their coaching staff was absolutely fantastic.
And so that leads us to a place where the NBA is about to have its 6th different champion in 6 seasons.
Yeah, that's right.
That is a fascinating, fun, exciting place for the league to be. We still have one more second round game to talk about, but this is such a weird, unprecedented like situation where you have teams that have like most of the teams haven't really been in this kind of mix anytime recently, and so we're going to see some fun. More fun than we got in New York. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I do think that the Boston, if they can get Porzingis back, which seems like it's on track for the middle of the next series, that they benefit here because Jokic was the guy who really was going to just cause a ton of problems for their defense. And now and they'll have home court advantage, obviously, regardless of who comes out of the West. I certainly think Minnesota or Dallas could beat them, but I think that Jokic was the one guy that I thought their defense just could not solve. And they would have tried a bunch of other things, but they don't have the Karl Anthony Towns to the Rudy Gobert the way that obviously Minnesota did. So I think this certainly boosts Boston's chances of winning, even though obviously I think whoever comes out of the West would give them a good series. And I mean, I think the last time we had 6 different champions off the top of my head was 75-80, which is not known actually as a banner time for the league for a number of reasons. And probably just the overall talent level was a lot lower. They expanded too much. There's the whole ABA thing, etc. But I think this is kind of a banner time for the league, and it's really fun. Have not been dominant super teams, and we thought that was going to maybe be the Denver Nuggets. And so I want to close on this then. If you're doing a post-mortem here, just while it's fresh on the Nuggets, like why weren't they able to get it done here?
A part of it is a team that is uniquely well-suited personnel-wise, and I would say from a coaching perspective, to negate some of their strengths. They had a better personnel to slow down Jokic, both with the initial assignment and with everything else. And then Edwards, I cannot emphasize enough how important Anthony Edwards' defense on Jamal Murray was in this series. Murray being limited health-wise, certainly a problem. But Murray being neutralized by Anthony Edwards overall in this series was really big. And then Denver, I'm sure people will criticize Calvin Booth for this. I think that's mostly unfair because of the second apron, the stuff that I've harped on all year about how hard it is to add talent. Like they functionally couldn't really bring Bruce Brown back. The Pacers offered him so much more money than they could really do. And then you're pretty much limited to minimum contracts. And, Justin Holiday was better for them overall than you possibly could have expected. Maybe a better backup center. Yeah. Maybe a better backup center could have been different there. But so it is maybe a sign that, and I think this is true. I mean, the metronome not being as consistent in the series overall, including, by the way, a 103.4 offensive rating in this game, that being a part of it, Jokic's defense being a little bit overstated, as great as he is. And remember that superlative performance that he put out in game 5, like that's still a part of this series, a part of this story. But the idea that Denver did have an easy road last year, they deserve full credit for beating all of those teams, but they did have an easier road, and that their dominance over the league might their margin from the rest of the league, even as a playoff team, might have been something that we didn't have a great test, a great evaluation on it. And so they can beat a lot of teams. Denver's firmly going to be in my mix for the championship next year, knowing what we know right now, if they can come into the postseason healthy, but they can be beaten. They have been beaten.
Yeah, and this team was perfectly designed to do it, and we'll see whether Minnesota, they've beaten 2 very different types of teams. They also haven't beaten a team with what I would consider to be a great defense yet, and that'll be, the Mavs I think will be the best defense they face. Of course, we'll talk about that in an upcoming episode, but Jokic didn't quite play well enough. You could just look at the 3-point shooting over the last couple of games, although you could also say that they shot just preposterously well in games 3 and 4, and we're like, oh well, that's who these guys are. They shoot preposterously well, and they still shot pretty darn well on 2-pointers away from the rim. But yeah, they couldn't crack open the rim, and this is right. Like the teams have focused on them for now this amount of time. Like they are at the top of the mountaintop that everyone was going for. The teams have come up with all these different strategies, have thought about how they're going to beat them over and over again when they weren't in that position.
Well, and Nate, who's probably thought more about that than any individual person? Tim Conley.
Sure. Yeah, of course he has.
The architect of the Nuggets team and the architect of the first team to beat this Nuggets team.
Yeah. So ultimately, I would say about the Nuggets, I think they could have won the series, but I wouldn't say that they should have won the series by any means. I think they were outplayed by Minnesota.
Yeah, and I mean, and I don't want to dwell on this, but like Jamal Murray could have been suspended for game 3, and that didn't happen either.
Right. Yeah, I think that of all the kind of random things that had happened, I think that was pretty equal. And they were healthy. Murray was not at the same level, of course, but that's part of the Jamal Murray experience. He does get hurt. Like the anomaly, I would say, is 2020 and 2023 when he was healthy, and he wasn't healthy for these last 3 postseasons or those other 3 postseasons. As he was healthy in 19, but he wasn't really quite at the same level yet. So yeah, they'll have an interesting offseason. Yeah, it would be nice, like Porter Jr. as well. Like the fact that they gave him that max contract and that he's just not producing at that type of a level, and that just makes it so difficult for them to get any depth. And of course, they also traded away a pick to go and get guys like Strother and Jalen Pickett and Hunter Tyson. We heard all about how those guys were going to do something good. I do think Strother is someone who can help. We thought that Watson was like this great find, and then Malone just wouldn't play him anymore. I think that was one thing I would question a little bit, is going totally away from him, because he is someone who could have matched Minnesota's athleticism and caused some problems for them and some chaos, even though, you know, Watson is not a great shooter.
Well, and helped give Denver some defensive identity in some specific minutes, which could have been useful. I'm not saying play him 20 minutes a game, but you could get 10.
Yeah, and I wasn't seeing him just like totally screwing up or something during those. I mean, they just were like, well, we can't have so many non-shooters on the floor, and we want Christian Braun out there instead. And Watson, he's a little too thin to guard Karl-Anthony Towns, so that was part of the problem as well. But certainly, Denver is a team, like, they're going to be right there again next year. Jokic is still going to be right there. I think Denver, part of the reason as well, maybe that they had a little more trouble and that they did look tired by the end, was they actually were being pushed for the number 1 seed, and they did push hard. In the end, maybe they would have been better off just being the 3 seed. I recall also that the Clippers were right there, at least right after the All-Star break, and then they faded, as it turned out. But they pushed really hard, and I think there's a feeling that they were maybe a little bit fatigued also. And they clearly were not at the same level. They didn't have Bruce Brown. Murray wasn't playing at the same level. So if they can get back to where they were last year, like, because I think you could say they didn't play anyone last year, but they also just were, I think you would agree, they weren't as good this year, right?
Yes, I would agree.
So let's take a few comments here before we move to the other series. Thanks y'all for being patient. Sonics repeated in 78 and 79. No, that is not correct.
No, the Bullets won in 78.
The Bullets won in 78. Yes,
they made the finals twice, but they didn't win both.
Yeah. Was Bruce Brown or a player like him missing for Denver? Absolutely.
Yes.
In the sense that they needed one more guy who could defend. Bruce Brown was actually a reliable 3-point shooter for them, more so than Brown was this year. And also a guy who could grab and go and give them a transition impetus. And Brown was a guy who would just push it down the throat of the other team until they would actually stop him. He got a bunch of transition buckets. I thought that Denver was not as good in transition these playoffs without him. Now, Bruce Brown might have been shooting over his head last year as well, and I don't know if he would have been a panacea, but also the fact that he could provide a little more ball handling relief too. He was a guy who could close games over Michael Porter Jr. Having to go to Brown there, Christian Braun there was just, he's just a little bit too limited offensively, even though he gets a lot out of what he is able to do. Let's see. What else we got here in terms of questions?
So Alex asked, did Michael Malone make a mistake not getting Jokic some breaks? I think so. I don't think you needed to go to a lot of them, but get a little bit there. And the template,
well, because he looked so tired too, I think, in the fourth. And I think they're just like, all right, we can't afford to sit him now, but I think they just had to.
I love that I'm invoking this coach. I thought Jason Kidd did a really good job of finding some spots and using a timeout to extend the time a little bit for Luka and for Kyrie, but especially Luka during game 6 of that series. And Malone could have done that too. Weaponize your timeouts a little bit, understand how you're going to do it, and say, we're not going to give him a ton of rest, but we're going to make sure that a vast majority of that is timeout rest rather than him actually sitting out for a ton of the game.
Trout notes that none of the last 5 NBA champions have advanced past the second round. That's remarkable, though. The Warrior or the Raptors got broken. Like, some of these teams have gotten broken up or have had injuries. Now, you could also say that that's just the nature of the league that we are in, right? And that's actually a note that I had that I wanted to get back to. Just, and we'll see it in the other series too when we talk about just what an unbelievably physical sport this has become. Not only just within the course of a game, but just what a grind it is over 82 games, and particularly because guys were playing more this season as well, and the amount of ground that you have to cover and how physical it is at the basket, and offensive rebounding is back. That's made it harder for everybody as well. And just being young and having length and having athleticism, that's really, like, the Mavericks, that was a huge part of them winning. Also, when the Knicks ran out of that, they lost. It's really been, and then you show also that it's just so much harder to repeat. We also haven't seen, super teams on the level of like the Warriors or the Heat necessarily, but it really has, and all of that and then having to come back and having a much shorter window the way the Nuggets did after last year, even though it wasn't a grueling playoffs. They did play pretty late. So yeah, it's I think just how incredibly physically exhausting this sport is to play right now, for sure, is something that sticks out to me. Any other questions or comments here that stuck out to you?
Not really. There was one asking if this is Rudy Gobert's best supporting cast. I would say so. There were
Easily.
there were
Not
some
even close.
good Jazz teams, but also like the best Jazz team never really happened because Gordon Hayward left as they drafted Donovan Mitchell. Those things, like, Hayward left after, but they never played together.
Evan says, as a Wolves fan, I always thought Karl-Anthony Towns' prior issues needed to be contextualized. Does this change, I guess, his reputation? And I think I noted this. I tried to give him credit, and I think also the way he's diversified his game. He's slowed down on his drive game. He really worked on both going left and finishing with his left hand. He had a beautiful left-handed finish in this game. So he still is prone to some of the stuff, but if you compare the shit that he was doing 2 years ago when he was just plowing into guys and committing absolutely asinine fouls, he's in better shape. He improved his body as well, even after the surgery. And so I think, like, the way that he's competed and worked to improve his weaknesses, he does deserve a lot of credit.
And it's his weaknesses on offense and defense, because what Towns did in this series against Jokic, they don't win if Towns doesn't defend Jokic as well as he does individually. If they have to go to that, if they have to try to switch up those matchups, everything gets different. And I think that Towns stepping up, you don't need him to be your best defender, but you need him to be a capable defender. And he was.
Denver, Donnie notes, didn't score 100 points in any of their losses. This is a very slow-paced series. It's been a very slow-paced playoffs, in part, I think, due to some of the issues that I was talking about. But
this was an under 90 possession game.
Yeah, but still, to hold Denver under 100 points 4 times is incredible defense. Richard says the Nuggets threw away too many picks in prior years, had none really left to trade. Yeah, it's a good point, and they did it to save money, right? That's now they got the Peyton Watson pick in a money and dumping move. Like, they would usually, go back to like the Kenneth Faried salary dump, Darrell Art, like that, just back in 18, 19, they had to throw away picks on some of those guys, and then of course they traded the 27 pick to get the number 30 in 2023. But that was Peyton Watson. That was a pretty good pick. But he's correct that they did not have picks that they could trade to go get another rotation player, which they really could have used. And they decided they have this long window for Jokic. They wanted to try to develop that guys. That did not work out. Justin Holiday was arguably their most reliable bench player. Brown was another one, though. They did actually just draft him and use that. But yeah, they haven't. And then they were able to acquire KCP without having to give up a pick, which was obviously massive. And then they also traded away picks for Gordon. So I can't quibble with it that much. They've made a couple of money saving moves. The other problem is they have no matching salary either.
Right.
There's no one really to trade away that they could bring back a guy making 20 million. They wouldn't have been able to do that. So I'm not sure. And Brown was just too successful of a signing. They couldn't afford to bring him back. All right, you want to talk Pacers and Knicks now?
Let's do it. And I don't want to start with the injuries, though we'll of course get there. This was just it was a bizarre game, and the place I want to start is Indiana's 2 point 2 point finishing, particularly their 2 point kind of like non-restricted area in the first 3 quarters of this game. Because even with everything else that happened, that is an unbelievably important part of this story. And so during the first 3 quarters, which I'm going to consider the competitive portion of this game, even if the Knicks did tighten it in the fourth quarter a couple of times, during that stretch, the Indiana Pacers shot 17 of 19 on 2 pointers away from the basket. And then they shot, a light 11 of 19 on threes during the first 3 quarters. And that is astonishing. That is completely ridiculous. That is what helps drive you to a 141 offensive rating and a 122 first shot half court offensive rating. And so, yes, there are a lot of other parts of the story, but that was completely ridiculous and incredible.
Yeah, and the Pacers, without Buddy Hield, we felt like they weren't quite as explosive. Obviously, better defensively as well, but they had some really explosive games. Particularly with Haliburton avoiding the malaise that he suffered weirdly in games 1 and 5, and he was fantastic. He was the guy that we wanted him to be in the other 5 games of the series, and part of that was because the Knicks wore down and ran out of guys, to be sure. But yeah, he was fantastic in this one. 6 of 12 from 3, was taking again some of these crazy, ridiculous threes that defined the first half of his season. And then I thought the thing that was most obvious, other than the Pacers' great shooting, I mean, Siakam was wonderful shooting foul line jumpers. Turner, like they were brought back like the pick and pop from the foul line. I think that at one point they were 7 of 7 on shots in the circle. So basically that circle around the foul line, if you looked at just the shot plot with all the green X's on it. So yeah, it was an incredible shooting performance by them for sure. And I thought their defense was not particularly amazing in this game, given who was actually available for the Knicks and how they were playing. But their offense just was completely unstoppable. And like, this is either the best or second best offense in the playoffs right now, like easily. And they really showed it in this one. But part of why they're able to show it, in addition to the great shot making, was just that the Knicks just didn't have it energy wise. Like Hartenstein came out and was fighting for some offensive rebounds early, but Hart couldn't bring the energy. Obviously, Anunoby only lasted 5 minutes. We told you what was going to happen on that one. Since the moment he went out in game 2, he tried to give it a shot. He looked like worse than James Harden in 2021. But yeah, the overall energy from the Knicks just wasn't there, and understandably so at this point.
Both teams were basically a draw in terms of offensive rebound rate. Technically, with team rebounds, the Pacers were ahead 32% to 31%. And the Knicks, they were really helped in the first part of the game by being low turnover, but then they had like 4 in rapid succession that really helped build the lead. And a truly wild stat that I probably wouldn't have found if I weren't just tooling around on this NBA page. The 2 players in the second round who played sufficient minutes, who had an over 20 usage rate, who had the highest true shooting in the entire second round, all 4 series, were both in this series. One of them is Tyrese Haliburton. Tyrese Haliburton, 68.7 true shooting on 23 usage overall in these 7 games. Number 1, though we only played 20 minutes a game, is actually Alec Burks. 69 true shooting on 22 usage. Burks had another big stretch in this one, scored 25 points in 27 minutes. But Haliburton, you and I both wanted him to have a larger role within the offense, and Haliburton provides so much more value than just scoring. And it's always, the amount of good passes he threw in this game are worth discussion, and we'll discuss that later. But he is also their best individual scorer too. That's just how good he is.
And the Knicks, I feel quite confident, if Brunson doesn't get hurt and Anunoby doesn't get hurt, end up winning this series relatively comfortably. And remember, like, Indiana barely won game 3. Like, it could have been 3-0. This could have just been a 5-gamer. And that, in the end, was where the Knicks truly lost this series, was not winning that game 3. Because then really at that point, they lost 3 of the last 4. And in all three of their losses, it was clear just how exhausted they were. They were able to summon that effort to win game 5, but at any point when Indiana was able to be on equal terms with them effort-wise, or I would even say out-effort them, particularly in game 6, the Knicks just didn't have the talent to keep up. And yeah, with Mitchell Robinson going down too, we didn't see him really at all in this series, but they could have really used him to get on the offensive glass, slow the pace down.
And Precious Chua not being good enough offensively to play the 4, that ended up becoming a bigger problem. And they needed him to do that because of Anunoby and Hart being limited. And one of the other weird elements of game 7 that ended up not affecting the final winner was I got aggressively frustrated with the Pacers at different points in this game where the Knicks only had one player who was taking and making 3-pointers in this
How do you
game.
let Donte DiVincenzo get 15 3-pointers up?
And there was a play where Andrew Nembhard, who is a very good help defender and can do things there, he's just like meandering. At times it was meandering, but at one point it was just he's looking at the primary action. Donte DiVincenzo relocates from the corner to above the break, and sort of Otto Porter Jr. style, Nembhard just doesn't even notice, just doesn't even react, and wasn't a face cut or anything like that. And DiVincenzo gets it up at 3. It's just like, you have one job. And if Nembhard is too good of a team defender to, like, if he's too active mentally as a team defender to do that, then put somebody else on him. He's the only guy that's shooting threes for them.
Yeah, in the end, though, it didn't matter because their offense just continued to be unstoppable. And the Knicks did actually get within 7, 77-70 in the third quarter. They even came back from down 20 in the first and looked like they might get back into it. They hold Indiana without any points for like the first 3 minutes of the third, after Indiana put up 70 in the first half and put up 39 in the first quarter, which is the most ever in a game 7 and second most ever for a half at 70 in a game 7, or first half of a game 7. And then they just turned it over a bunch of times in a row. McConnell came in and settled them down with those little hop 2-pointers. Again, the Pacers mid-range shooting coming to bear. And the other critical stretch I thought was Haliburton scoring 14 points in about 3 minutes late in the third, including hitting 3 threes of increasingly ridiculous difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
And Nesmith also was 8 for 8 in this game. He was fantastic driving the ball. He's really improved there over his Boston days. But yeah, I mean, there's not that much else to say. I mean, in the end, like, the Pacers offense was awesome, but the Knicks defense was pretty terrible and exhausted by the end.
A couple other things that were memorable for me. Tyrese Haliburton going off in the late first. There was an 11-2.
Yeah, that's what I just mentioned.
Yeah, the 11-2 Haliburton run. And then right around that time, at the beginning of the second quarter, they ended up having Brunson and Haliburton off the floor together. And the Knicks lost those minutes 9-3. And you're like, oh, crap. That was like one of their potential chances. Even though the Knicks have been so bad when Brunson's been off the floor largely in that series. And then there was that awesome Tyrese Haliburton jumping bounce pass to Miles Turner, where he creates the angle with the jump pass and then just like brings it around. That was just fantastic. He's such a good passer.
And then Brunson goes out. The game was pretty much over at that point. He goes out late 30, injured his thumb, swiping in on, I think it was Haliburton, on a fast break. Broke his hand, I guess is what they called it. It looked like a thumb issue on his left hand. So that extinguished any hope of a Knick comeback. He was only 6 of 17 before that for 17 points. Got a couple of BS foul draws. That was the other thing, that the Pacers just kept reaching in and picking up cheap fouls.
That's right.
Kind of keeping the Knicks in the game. The Knicks ended up with 27 free throw attempts. But Brunson just didn't seem to have it. And I thought it was very impressive that he was able to gut things out in game 5 and put up that game. But and then he also had that second half of game 2 where he was really good. But he clearly didn't have anywhere near the kind of explosiveness. They tried to get it more going in the off the ball game. That didn't work exceedingly well. He also just missed a bunch of shots. I thought Miles Turner also was really good in this game with 4 block shots. And he was plus 19, really he had a couple of games in which he really walled off the rim for Indiana. It's certainly going to need him to do that in the next series, as we'll talk about it at some point in the future here. But I mean, Brunson, if he could have been the guy from before he got hurt, maybe they still could have won this series, even with everything else that went wrong. So,
one other weird thing from this game. Even though OG Anunoby couldn't run and couldn't really move, he still got those 2 big jumpers early in the game. It ended up being a 2 and a 3. And now I was just stunned that happened.
I think everyone knew that he wasn't going to be able to play. I mean, Tibbs subbed him out. He supposedly was available to return. They didn't like the way he was moving. He couldn't run. And also, like, he kind of needs to be able to run for his role. Like, it wasn't James Harden, who doesn't really run that much anyway from back in 2021. And James Harden probably shouldn't have been out there. I think maybe they tried to play him because of Hart and his own issues, where Hart was not the same guy. I thought he really struggled to shoot from 3 as well. A bunch of his shots were short. He wasn't the same force as a driver getting downhill or in transition or anything. They were able to hide Haliburton on him for a large portion of the game without really getting hurt by it. But it was, I mean, maybe they just wanted him out there for the first 5 minutes to give him a boost, but like, it was obvious that he couldn't even move. Like, from the opening tip, you're like, oh, no, this is absurd that he's out there. And I think maybe they always knew that, and it was just an attempt to do another Willis Reed type of thing. But if they actually felt like he was legitimately going to be able to go out there and like play real minutes in this game, that was absurd.
Well, and as Donnie noted, it could have been deflating for the Knicks when you saw that, oh, he absolutely can't be out there. Now, they probably saw it in practices and shoot runs, which we did not. But to me, be like, oh, yeah, he absolutely doesn't have it. Like, and it seems like the medical staff would have had to know that. The coaching staff would have had to have known that. And for Anunoby to try that, to gut it out with his unrestricted free agency coming, I'm guessing he has confidence that a deal is there. But I mean, there was a risk for further injury, for re-injury there.
And you don't want to re-injure that too, because then you kind of get into this situation where you have all this scar tissue. Harden was saying quite frankly, I would say he's never fully been the same attacking the basket since that hamstring injury. Some of that could be age. But yeah, I mean, you don't want to just go out there and just like suffering more and more small tears in the area that's already still torn. But like, yeah, like for them to clear him without being like, hey, OG, how about you just run down to the other end of the court? Like, if he couldn't even do that, yeah, probably shouldn't be out there, I would say. See if I had anything else on this one. All right, let's take a couple of comments here, and maybe we'll preview the East Finals at some other time. I think, because I'm pretty exhausted after like 9 hours of content today. Let's see here. Oh yeah, we got a couple of questions. Simon talking about Minnesota betting on Edwards to be this good this early, and there was a question earlier of like, if this is the high point of the Rudy Gobert era for Minnesota, was it worth it? I think 100% yes.
Yeah, and they wouldn't have won the series without him. They wouldn't have been in this place.
No, of course not. Of course not.
So yeah, I mean it.
And I think even if they had lost this game, it still would have been worth it to me, because they'll probably be pretty good again for the next couple of years too.
Yeah. And another huge part of that, obviously, this is not the time to do Minnesota's offseason preview. The ownership's willingness to pay, and boy, is it an ownership situation that's complicated to parse on this. Ownership's willing to pay is always a little bit fluid, and Minnesota making not only the conference finals, not only knocking out the champs, but potentially making it further. We don't know yet how things are going to go from this point. That changes this whole dynamic, and so now maybe that, I don't think they're going to pay like a, second apron bill necessarily, but whoever's running the team, it's a lot more tolerable to do that after the fact, after your team has already been as successful as they have, than to have to like go into the offseason and say, we have to tear it down, at least partially financially.
Simon says, speaking to the point about how physical the sport is depth something you should consider important for the playoffs? I think everybody wants to have depth for sure, but it just, especially now with the change in the CBA, it's become even harder to do. Denver is a perfect example of that. And, would they try to move Michael Porter Jr. and split him up into some other players? Well, okay, it's great, but then you don't you probably need at least one elite shooter on your team who's an off-ball guy. Like, where else are you going to get that? I do think Porter Jr. slipping a lot defensively this year is probably something that wasn't talked about enough for Denver, that he needed to be hidden in a way which I didn't feel like he did last year. And I think also teams, frankly, just didn't do a good enough job of attacking him last year.
Sure.
And I'm not sure whether he's just slowing down. He's got all these physical issues, obviously, which he deserves credit for battling through. But he's not the same athlete that he was certainly before the back injury. Like, I mean, he used to get a bunch of like backdoor cuts and like finish inside, get offensive rebounds like that, get tip dunks. Like, that just doesn't happen anymore. But back to the idea of depth, I think certainly building the team that way might be a little bit more viable than in the past, because there aren't super teams, right? Like, it used to be, you have 2 of the 5 best players in the NBA in the same team. Like, that team doesn't exist right now. And so, particularly in the regular season, making it through there, just generally being a younger team, I think is important. Like, the whole, let's sign a bunch of minimum veterans because veterans know how to defend. I think it's no coincidence that some of the best defensive teams this year have a lot of like young athletic players.
Sure. And just because I'm thinking about it with Michael Porter Jr., the final year of his contract is only partially guaranteed for $12 million unless he makes an All-Star.
No, I thought it guaranteed when they won the championship.
Oh, it might have. I might not have put that in my notes. You might be right. I can't remember what all the benchmarks in the contract were. I'll look it up. Team specific stuff.
The bane of the spreadsheet. Well, that's as good a thing to end this on as anything. So thanks so much for joining us throughout today on YouTube. We'll be back. I think we'll do every conference finals game, at least as long as the individual series are competitive, on playback and of course on YouTube. And you can subscribe on YouTube, give us a like. Thanks for everyone who commented. If you want to hit the little notifications for the bell as well, that's it's for when we go live or when a new podcast posts. And you can also subscribe to Dunc'd On Prime and get our wrap-ups of every single game remaining, plus all of the off-season outlooks, which we got to get into here. This round's been so busy, we haven't started that yet. We're going to do probably scouts on the top 10 of the draft. So this is, I would say, the best time to be a Dunc'd On Prime subscriber. I hope you will agree. We'll talk to you all next time.